Let's get back to the fallout from Labor's first budget now. And there was some interesting analysis in the Australian Financial Review yesterday from Stephen Hamilton. He's the Assistant Professor of Economics at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He wrote in the Financial Review, "This is easily the weakest economic and fiscal strategy of any government since the Charter of Budget Honesty was established. This Treasurer has no budget goals, no rules to discipline himself." Hamilton thinks tax increases are inevitable. I caught up with him earlier and he explained why he had low expectations for Labor's first budget in almost a decade.
Yeah, I think the issue is, the opposition was in opposition for a decade, right? They had a very long time to figure out exactly what they wanted to do, exactly how they wanted to manage things, come up with the kind of strategy they wanted to implement. And so, I think there were some high expectations that when they came to power, they would implement some of those plans. And I had some optimism that maybe some good would come from it. But I think since the election, I've been kind of persistently a bit disappointed with what I've seen from the government. So I think the Job Summit is a good example, right? We had a lot of people come together. We had a lot of talking. We didn't have a lot of action, right? The economic statements, similar things. A lot of talking, a lot of attacking the opposition, not a lot of action. And so I kind of looked to the budget to hope that maybe that's where we would see some action on some of the problems we have. And unfortunately, we didn't see much of that.
Indeed, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, seems to be softening people up. He calls it conditioning people about the structural problems in the deficit without actually doing anything about it. Do you think he's softening the country up for tax increases?
Well, look, I think there's no doubt that we have a very big structural deficit, right? I mean, it's something like 2% of GDP. And to put that into perspective, it's in the order of the entire defence budget, right? We're overspending in the order of the entire defence budget. So that's going to take a lot to kind of deal with, right? And there's only two ways you can fix that. You either have to reduce spending or you have to increase taxes. There's no kind of sort of rocket science here, right? So one way or the other, we have to close that deficit soon, and both of those options are quite difficult. So I don't blame the Treasurer. I think it's great that he wants to have the conversation. I think it's terrific that he wants to kind of start to get people used to what we're going to have to do to close that gap. But the trouble is, I think that's going to require more than just a conversation. We're actually going to have to take some very hard decisions. And the start of that process has to be setting a rigid, disciplined set of rules under which the budget is going to move forward. That, to me, would be the kind of credible way to start that conversation.
Do you think, though, that he's looking at tax increases in the medium term? Because the other way, of course, to fix that structural problem is cutting costs, cutting expenditure in the budget. And that would have actually been very useful right now to help slay what the Treasurer calls the inflation dragon.
Yes, so we have to understand the gap is huge. So it's not something that we can just trim a bit here and trim a bit there and solve the problem, right? It's again, the entire defence budget. That's how big the gap is. So my guess is the gap is going to have to be made up with combination of tax and spending. And indeed, before the election, the Treasury Secretary, Stephen Kennedy, said as much. So it's going to have to be a combination. I don't think anyone out there should expect the taxes aren't going to go up. I don't think there's any way around it without that. But I, at the same time, think we do need discipline on the spending side. I think the increase in costs in things like the NDIS, in aged care, in defence even, right? So many of these areas are experiencing such radical increases that, they're going to need to be restrained at least to some degree. So I think we have to think about this problem as coming from both sides, a containment of spending, a reduction in spending in some ways, but also an increase in taxes. And so then the pressure moves to, if we're going to increase taxes, making sure we do that in a way that's sensible rather than kind of simple but damaging.
So where do you expect to see that happen, given the Labor Party is committed to the legislated stage 3 tax cuts? Do you expect other areas to be focused for tax increases? Do you think they'd even tackle broadening the base of the GST?
Yeah, look, Jim Chalmers has already ruled out broadening the base of the GST, increasing the rate. Economists like me, that's kind of like, the holy grail, right, is improving the GST so that it applies to everything, and maybe raising the rate to 15 to 20%. That's universally accepted kind of among economists as the best way to kind of close this gap. I'd be surprised if stage 3 tax cuts survive, to be honest. I'm almost certain they're going to at least walk back some of it. And there is a way to do the stage 3 so that it's redesigned and we maintain some tax relief, but maybe a little less generous. So maybe you could gain $8 billion a year that would close maybe a quarter of the gap that we need. So again, we got to think about combinations of different options that can help us get to the final answer. I think the other obvious answer on tax is superannuation tax concessions. No discussion of tax reform, no discussion of revenue increases can happen without talking about those very generous tax concessions that go to superannuation holders.
Just finally and briefly, Stephen, given what we've seen in the budget, what do you expect to see to the Australian happen to the Australian budget and economy in the coming year?
Yeah, look, I think they're walking a very difficult tightrope. Inflation is very high. And in fact, the day after the budget, we saw inflation come out higher than expectations at 7.3%. And to be honest, they forecast massive increases in gas prices and electricity prices with no policy solution at all. It's very difficult to believe that they won't have to act on that, which could be pretty significant. So I think at the moment, we have so much uncertainty. What happens over the next 12 to 18 months is pretty much impossible to predict. So the government is going to have to stay nimble and willing to respond to conditions, but they can't lose sight of the long term. And that was my big disappointment in the budget. No real plan, no real strategy with dealing with the long term. And I think that's what I want to see in the May budget.
Stephen Hamilton, thanks so much for joining us.
Cheers, Chris.
Tax increases, new taxes, get ready.